It was a quiet evening, the kind that usually brought a sense of peace after a long day. The soft hum of the city outside barely reached the walls of our apartment, creating a cocoon of silence that should have been comforting. But tonight, something felt off, a subtle tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. I was heading to the kitchen when I heard voices, soft, intimate whispers coming from the living room. My heart skipped a beat. I recognized the voices immediately. One was Emily's, my wife of 7 years, and the other belonged to Leo Harris, a pianist we had both come to know well. Curiosity, or perhaps it was an instinctive fear, made me pause in the hallway, just out of sight. I strained to hear what they were saying, the words muffled but clear enough. Leo, Emily's voice was barely above a whisper, laden with emotion. I can't keep doing this. Every time I see you, it gets harder to pretend that what we have is just friendship. A heavy silence followed, one that seemed to stretch on forever. I felt a chill run down my spine, the kind that starts at your core and spreads until it feels like you're freezing from the inside out. Emily, I feel the same, Leo finally replied, his voice gentle but firm. But I can't stay away from you. I don't want to. What we have, it's real. My breath caught in my throat. The reality of their words hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just some innocent flirtation. This was betrayal, deep, personal, and completely shattering. My Emily, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, was in love with another man. And not just any man, Leo, the celebrated pianist who had become a regular guest in our home, someone I had foolishly welcomed into our lives. I felt as though the ground beneath me had vanished, leaving me suspended in a void of disbelief and rage. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My hands began to tremble as the weight of the truth bore down on me. Sam doesn't suspect anything, Emily continued, her voice tinged with guilt but also a determination that made my stomach turn. But I can't live this life forever. I need to figure out what to do. Leo sighed, and I could almost hear the sorrow in his breath. I'll wait for you, Emily. However long it takes. That was it. The final, devastating blow. I couldn't listen anymore. I turned on my heel and walked away, my footsteps silent but my mind screaming. I grabbed my coat and keys from the entryway, moving like a ghost in my own home. My vision blurred with anger and pain as I opened the door, the cold air of the night hitting me like a slap in the face. Without looking back, I stepped outside, letting the door close quietly behind me. As it clicked shut, something inside me broke, something fundamental and irreplaceable. I stood on the street, my chest heaving with the effort to keep myself together, but it was no use. The anger surged through me, hot and fierce, mingling with the icy dread that gripped my heart. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to confront them both right then and there. But something held me back. Something deeper, more calculating. A small, dark part of me whispered that revenge wouldn't be sweet if it was served in the heat of the moment. No, this wound was too deep, too personal. I needed to be smart about this. And as I stood there, alone in the cold, an idea began to take shape, a plan so precise and cruel that it almost frightened me. I would make them pay. But not with fists or harsh words. I would turn their betrayal into their undoing, and I would do it in a way they would never see coming. With one last look at the apartment, I turned and walked into the night, my mind already racing with the beginnings of my plan. I knew what I had to do, and I knew exactly how I would do it. They had shattered me, but I would make sure they regretted every single note. The cold night air did little to cool the fire burning inside me as I walked aimlessly through the streets. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming need to do something, anything, to regain control of my life. The image of Emily and Leo together was seared into my mind, a relentless torment that only fueled my rage. I couldn't just confront them. That would be too easy, too quick. It wouldn't give me the satisfaction I craved, the sense of justice that gnawed at my insides. No, I needed something more, something that would make them feel the same pain they had inflicted on me. As I wandered, lost in thought, I found myself near a small, familiar park. In the distance, the faint sound of a piano drifted through the air. Cutting through the chaos in my mind, I stopped, listening. The melody was haunting and beautiful, yet filled with a kind of melancholy that resonated with my feelings. It was then that an idea began to form, an idea so perfect, so fitting, that I almost smiled. Leo was a pianist, a celebrated one at that. He had always been proud of his talent, his music, The way he could captivate an audience with just a few notes. It was what drew people to him, what had probably drawn Emily to him. And that was exactly where I would strike. I remembered, almost with a sense of irony, that I had once played the piano myself. It was years ago, during college. I had taken lessons out of curiosity, nothing serious, just enough to appreciate the instrument and play a few simple pieces. But now, that forgotten skill seemed like a gift, an opportunity to beat Leo at his own game. I would learn to play again, but not just to play. I would master it, surpass him in every way possible. I would become everything he prided himself on, everything he thought made him special. And when the time was right, I would challenge him, force him to see his inadequacy in the thing he loved most. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how perfect it was. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming my power, about turning their betrayal into my victory. I would make them both watch as I took away the one thing they thought was theirs: Leo's talent, his music, his very identity as a pianist. I made up my mind then and there. I would find a teacher, the best one I could afford, and dedicate myself to becoming a pianist that Leo could never hope to match. The hours, the effort, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the result, the moment when I would expose him for the fraud he was in front of everyone who had ever admired him. I turned back towards home, my steps now purposeful, the fury in my chest slowly transforming into a cold, calculated determination. This would take time, patience, and discipline, traits I had always prided myself on. I would have to play the long game, keeping my emotions in check, hiding my intentions from Emily, from Leo, from everyone. But that was fine. I could wait. The sweetness of victory would only be intensified by the time it took to achieve it. And when that day finally came, when I sat across from Leo and played him into the ground, I would savor every second of his humiliation. The music that had once soothed my soul would now become my weapon. And with it, I would compose a symphony of vengeance that neither Leo nor Emily would ever forget. The next morning, the determination that had taken root in my mind only grew stronger. The decision was made, and now it was time to act. I needed a teacher, someone who could help me unlock the potential I knew I had buried deep inside. But not just any teacher, someone who understood the depth of my resolve, and who could push me to the limits of my abilities and beyond. The first few days were frustrating. I combed through music schools, contacted instructors, and even sat in on a few lessons. But none of them felt right. These teachers were skilled, certainly, but they lacked the intensity I sought. They were more interested in cultivating a casual hobby or refining techniques for students already proficient in the basics. I needed something more, someone who could guide me through the grueling transformation I envisioned. My search led me to a small, dimly lit music store tucked away in a narrow alley downtown. The place was almost forgotten by time, with dusty shelves filled with old sheet music and instruments that had seen better days. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if this was exactly where I was supposed to be. The store owner was an elderly man with sharp eyes that seemed to see through me. He asked what I was looking for, and when I told him, his gaze lingered on me for a moment as if weighing my words against something deeper. "You don't just want to learn how to play," he said quietly. "You want to master it." I nodded, surprised by how easily he had understood. "Yes, I need to become the best." He studied me for another long moment, then turned and disappeared into a back room without a word. I stood there, unsure of what to expect, until he returned a few minutes later with a small, yellowed business card. He handed it to me, his expression unreadable. "Go to this address. Ask for Maestro Williams. If anyone can help you, it's him." I took the card, thanking the man before leaving the store. The name was unfamiliar to me, but the weight of his words left no doubt in my mind. I had found who I was looking for. The address led me to a modest house on the outskirts of the city, its facade worn but well kept. I hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door, wondering what kind of person I was about to meet. The door opened, revealing a tall, gaunt man with silver hair pulled back neatly. His face was lined with age, but his eyes burned with a sharp intensity that took me by surprise. He looked me over, as if assessing my very soul, and then gave a single, curt nod. "I'm Samuel," I introduced myself. Feeling suddenly unsure. "I was told you could help me learn the piano." He didn't respond immediately, just stepped aside to let me in. The interior of the house was as unadorned as the exterior, except the grand piano that dominated the living room. It was a beautiful instrument, obviously well cared for, with a presence that demanded respect. "I am Williams," he finally said, his voice deep and resonant. "What is it you hope to achieve, Samuel?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. But something in his gaze told me that lies would be futile here. "I need to become better than someone," I said, my voice steady. "Someone who has taken something from me. I want to surpass him in what he does best." Williams's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing for a long moment. Then, without warning, he walked over to the piano and sat down, his fingers hovering above the keys. "Play something for me," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. I approached the piano, my heart pounding. I hadn't touched a piano in years, and the prospect of playing in front of someone like Williams was daunting. But I swallowed my nerves, sat down beside him, and placed my fingers on the keys. The melody that came out was simple and hesitant, a piece I remembered from my college days. I played it as best as I could, but the rustiness of my skills was painfully obvious. When I finished, the silence in the room was suffocating. Williams didn't speak or even look at me. Just continued staring at the piano as if lost in thought. "You have potential," he said at last, his voice softer than before. "But the potential is worthless without discipline and sacrifice. What you seek will not come easily. It will require everything you have, and more." "I'm ready," I replied without hesitation. The fire in my chest flared brighter, feeding off his words. Williams finally turned to face me, his eyes locking onto mine. "Very well. I will teach you. But understand this, I am not interested in your reasons or your past. You will work, you will suffer, and only then, perhaps, will you achieve what you desire. If you accept these terms, then we begin tomorrow." A weight seemed to lift off my shoulders, replaced by a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. "I accept." Williams nodded once more, a faint glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Then I will see you at 6 in the morning. Do not be late." As I left his house, the cold air outside felt invigorating. Almost electrifying. The path ahead would be difficult, that much was clear. But I had found my teacher, and with him, the means to exact my revenge. The maestro had seen the fire in me, and he would help me forge it into something unstoppable. And when the time came, I would use it to burn Leo's world to the ground. The next morning, I arrived at Williams's house just before 6, the first light of dawn barely touching the sky. The air was crisp, biting against my skin as I knocked on the door. Feeling the weight of the day ahead. When Williams opened the door, he didn't greet me with pleasantries. He simply nodded and led me inside, directly to the piano where my transformation would begin. From that day on, my life became a blur of black and white keys, endless hours spent in front of the piano, and the world outside fading into insignificance. The routine was brutal: early mornings, late nights, my fingers moving over the keys until they were raw and aching. But the pain didn't matter. Nothing mattered except mastering the instrument that had once been nothing more than a distant hobby. Williams was relentless. He pushed me harder than I'd ever been pushed before, his instructions sharp, his criticisms biting. But with every harsh word and every correction, I felt myself getting closer to my goal. My initial clumsiness slowly gave way to something resembling competence, and then, as the weeks turned into months, to something even more powerful. It wasn't just about learning the notes or perfecting the technique. It was about channeling every ounce of my emotion, every fragment of my shattered soul, into the music. My playing became an outlet for the anger and pain that had been consuming me. Each piece I learned, each note I struck, was a step closer to reclaiming what had been taken from me. My life outside of Williams's house ceased to exist. I stopped going to work, ignoring calls and emails, letting my career slip through my fingers like sand. Friends reached out, concerned by my sudden disappearance from their lives, but I didn't respond. They couldn't understand, no one could. My world had narrowed down to one singular purpose: surpassing Leo. Emily became a ghost in our shared apartment. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was as though we were strangers. The tension between us was thick, but I had no energy left to confront her, no desire to dredge up the pain I had buried deep beneath my music. It was easier to pretend she didn't exist, to lose myself in the world I was creating at the piano. Williams noticed the change in me. At first, he said nothing, simply observing as I poured myself into the lessons with a fervor that bordered on madness. But as the weeks passed, as my playing grew more confident and more expressive, he began to acknowledge the progress I was making. "You're improving," he remarked one evening after I finished a particularly challenging piece. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of approval that hadn't been there before. "Your control, your expression, it's all coming together." The praise was rare, but when it came, it fueled me like nothing else. I played with even greater intensity, pushing my limits further each day. Williams's praise was a sign that I was on the right path and that the countless hours of sacrifice were paying off. And yet, there was no satisfaction, no peace in the progress I made. Instead, my obsession deepened. The more I played, the more I realized how far I still had to go. I could feel the talent reawakening in me, the old skills returning and blending with the new techniques I had learned. But it was never enough. I could hear Leo's playing in my head, always a step ahead, always better, and it drove me to the edge. The apartment, once a place of comfort, became a prison I only returned to out of necessity. I ate sparingly and slept even less, my mind constantly replaying the melodies I practiced during the day. Emily, if she noticed, said nothing. She was lost in her world, her guilt, perhaps. Or maybe she simply didn't care anymore. Months passed in this way, a relentless cycle of practice and more practice. My fingers grew stronger and more agile, moving with a speed and precision that surprised even me. Williams pushed me harder with each passing week, his lessons becoming more intense and more demanding. But I welcomed the challenge, the opportunity to hone my skills further. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, I finished a piece that had once seemed impossible to me. The final notes hung in the air, a perfect blend of power and delicacy. The result of months of grueling effort. Williams, who had been standing silently behind me, stepped forward. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a rare gesture of approval that sent a jolt of something like pride through me. "You've come far, Samuel," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that matched the moment. "Farther than most. But you must remember that the pursuit of perfection is endless. There is always more to learn and more to achieve. Do not lose sight of your goal." His words struck a chord deep within me. The fire that had driven me from the start still burned brightly, but it had changed. It was no longer a simple flame of anger and pain, it had become something more, a fierce, unyielding desire to be the best, to reclaim not just what I had lost, but to rise above it. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a mantle. "I won't stop," I replied, my voice steady. "Not until I'm the best." Williams's hand lingered on my shoulder for a moment longer before he stepped back. His sharp eyes gleaming with something that might have been respect. "Then keep playing, Samuel. And when you're ready, you will face your rival, not as a man seeking revenge, but as a true master of the piano." I absorbed his words, letting them sink into the core of my being. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, I felt a flicker of confidence, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could achieve the impossible. The piano had become my life, my obsession, my path to redemption. And as I sat there in the fading light, I knew that I would follow that path to its very end, no matter the cost. It had been nearly 6 months since I had plunged headfirst into my relentless pursuit of mastering the piano. My life had become a narrowed tunnel of notes and rhythms, where everything beyond the music ceased to matter. The pain that had once threatened to consume me was now the fuel driving me forward, sharpening my focus with every passing day. I was so absorbed in my training that I had almost forgotten the world outside, until fate decided to remind me. I hadn't planned on going out that day, but something about the suffocating silence of my apartment pushed me to leave. The piano keys, as familiar as they were, felt like chains that morning, and I needed air, space, something different, even if just for a moment. So, I found myself wandering the city streets, aimless because of the need to escape my obsession. It was mid-afternoon when I passed by a small cafe, one of those cozy, tucked-away places where people went to escape the bustle of the city. I glanced inside, considering whether to stop for a coffee, when I saw them. Emily and Leo. They were sitting at a table by the window, their heads close together, lost in conversation. Emily was laughing, her face lit up with a brightness I hadn't seen in months. And Leo? He was the picture of effortless charm, his smile as confident as ever, his hand resting casually on hers. The sight of them together hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I just stood there, rooted to the spot. 1,000 emotions swirling inside me: anger, jealousy, a bitter sadness I hadn't allowed myself to feel in weeks. But beneath it all was something colder, more calculated. This was the man who had taken everything from me, the one I had been preparing to face. And here he was, oblivious, carefree, as if the world was his to enjoy. I could have walked away, could have let them have their moment without interference. But the rage and the twisted satisfaction of what I knew was coming wouldn't allow it. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the bell above the entrance jingling softly as I did. Leo noticed me first. His eyes widened in surprise, and then a wide smile spread across his face, a smile that made my blood boil. "Samuel, what a surprise," he called out, his tone light and friendly, as if we were old friends bumping into each other by chance. "Join us, won't you?" Emily's expression was harder to read. For a split second, I saw a flash of something like guilt in her eyes. But she quickly masked it with a forced smile. She gestured to the empty chair at their table, her movements stiff, as if she too was struggling with the suddenness of our meeting. I forced a smile onto my face, the muscles in my jaw tight as I approached their table. "Leo, Emily," I greeted them, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil beneath. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did we," Leo chuckled, completely unaware of the tension simmering just below the surface. "It's been a while. How have you been?" "Busy," I replied, taking the seat opposite them. I made a point of meeting Emily's eyes, watching as she quickly looked away, her fingers fidgeting with the napkin in her lap. "Very busy." Leo nodded, leaning back in his chair. "You know, I've been meaning to ask you something, Samuel. I've heard you used to play the piano. Is that true?" His question caught me off guard, though I masked my surprise. "Yes," I admitted, choosing my words carefully. "I used to, a long time ago." "Well, here's an idea," Leo said, leaning forward with that same easy smile that made my skin crawl. "How about we get together and play sometime? You know, just for fun, a little friendly competition, if you're up for it." Emily looked at him sharply, her eyes flicking between us, but she said nothing. I could see the discomfort in her expression and the way her hands clenched slightly under the table. She was afraid of what might happen, of the tension she could sense between us even if Leo couldn't. And for a moment, I considered declining, sparing her the inevitable conflict. But then I remembered why I had been doing all this. Every hour of practice, every ounce of pain channeled into perfecting my skills. This was the opportunity I had been waiting for. "That sounds like a great idea," I said, my tone just as light as his. "I could use a break from all the work I've been doing. A little piano duel might be just what I need." Leo's grin widened, clearly pleased with my response. "Perfect. How about this weekend? I've got a place where we can play, just the two of us. It'll be fun, I promise." "Looking forward to it," I replied, my smile never faltering, even as the anticipation of what was to come surged through me. As we continued our small talk, I could feel the heat of Emily's gaze on me and could see the worry in her eyes that she couldn't quite hide. She knew something was wrong, and could sense the cold calculation in my words, even if Leo was oblivious. But she said nothing, and neither did I. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, Leo would find out just how fun our little competition would be. When I finally left the cafe, I did so with a calm exterior, but inside, the fire was burning brighter than ever. The stage was set, and the first move had been made. All that was left now was to wait for the weekend, for the moment when Leo would realize that he had invited his downfall. The days leading up to the weekend felt like a blur, a mix of intense preparation and careful calculation. I knew this wasn't just a casual meeting, not for me. This was my chance to finally put Leo in his place, to show him and Emily that I was not someone to be taken lightly. The months of grueling practice had led to this moment, and I wasn't about to waste it. Every evening after my lessons with Williams, I would sit down at the piano and pore over potential compositions Leo might suggest for our friendly duet. I went through countless pieces, analyzing their complexities and the subtle ways they could be manipulated to expose weaknesses. I played each one over and over, memorizing every note, every pause, every shift in tempo, until they were etched into my very being. But it wasn't enough to simply be prepared. I needed a plan, a way to subtly undermine Leo during our performance, to make him falter in front of me. The idea of humiliating him, of watching his confidence crumble, was a thought that had sustained me through the darkest hours of my practice. It wasn't just about revenge, It was about reclaiming my sense of worth. I envisioned different scenarios, ways to catch him off guard, to push him into making mistakes. Perhaps I would suggest a particularly challenging piece, one that required the utmost precision and control. Or maybe I would subtly alter the tempo, just enough to throw him off balance. The possibilities were endless, and I explored each one with meticulous detail. As the day of the duet drew nearer, I became more focused, more consumed by my plan. But the closer I got, the more I noticed Emily's growing unease. She had been quiet since our encounter at the cafe, watching me with a mixture of suspicion and concern that she couldn't quite mask. She wasn't stupid, she could see that something had changed in me, that the man sitting across from her at the dinner table each night was not the same one she had known before. One evening, just 2 days before the planned duet, she finally confronted me. We were in the kitchen, the sound of water boiling on the stove filling the silence between us. I was lost in thought, my mind running through the various strategies I had devised when her voice broke through. "Samuel," she began hesitantly, her eyes fixed on the countertop as she spoke. "I've noticed that you've been different lately. More distant, more intense. Is everything okay?" I looked at her, seeing the worry etched in her features, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of something, guilt, perhaps. Or maybe regret what I was about to do. But it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the cold resolve that had carried me this far. "Everything's fine, Emily," I said, reassuringly smiling. "I've just been focused on work, on getting back into playing the piano. It's been a lot to juggle, but I'm managing." She didn't look convinced. "It's not just that, though, is it? You've been different since that day at the cafe. You and Leo, are you really okay with everything? With being around him?" I could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that I might finally confront her about what had happened between them, that the fragile peace we had maintained since that day would shatter. But I couldn't let her see the truth, not yet. Not until I had finished what I had set out to do. "Leo's your friend, Emily," I said softly, reaching out to take her hand. "I'm not going to let anything get in the way of that. If playing with him makes you happy, then I'm happy to do it too. It's just music, after all." She searched my face, looking for any sign of deception, and I made sure to keep my expression calm and reassuring. It was a delicate balance, keeping her suspicions at bay while maintaining the front that everything was normal. But it was necessary, just another part of the plan. Finally, she nodded, though the uncertainty didn't completely leave her eyes. "If you say so," she murmured, squeezing my hand lightly. "I just want things to be okay between us. I want us to be happy. We will be," I promised, knowing full well that my definition of happiness was very different from hers. "After this weekend, everything will be fine." She smiled then, a small, tentative smile that spoke of hope, of the belief that we could somehow mend the broken pieces of our relationship. And for that brief moment, I almost wished it were true, that we could go back to how things were before. But I knew better. Too much had happened, and the only way forward was through the fire I had started. As she turned back to the stove, I let out a slow breath, steeling myself for what was to come. The day of the duet was fast approaching, and there was no turning back now. Leo had no idea what awaited him, and Emily, despite her suspicions, would never see it coming. All that was left was to play the part one had so carefully crafted, and to ensure that when the time came, Leo would be the one to face the music. The night of the duet arrived with a quiet intensity, the air heavy with anticipation. I had spent the entire day in a state of focused calm, my mind clear, my hands steady. There was no room for doubt, no space for second-guessing. Everything I had worked for, every hour of practice, every calculated move, had led to this moment. The cafe, where the showdown was set to take place, was small and intimate, with dim lighting that cast warm shadows across the walls. A modest crowd had gathered, just enough to make the atmosphere feel charged without being overwhelming. Among them were a few of Leo's friends and colleagues. People who knew him as the charming, talented pianist he portrayed himself to be. They were here to witness a friendly performance, but they had no idea what was about to unfold. Emily sat near the front, her expression tense, her eyes darting between Leo and me. She had been quiet all evening, her unease palpable. I knew she was still grappling with the change she had sensed in me, but tonight, she was powerless to stop what was about to happen. Leo arrived shortly after I did, a confident smile on his face as he entered the cafe. He greeted his friends with easy charm, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries as if this were just another casual evening. When his eyes met mine, he gave me a nod, a sign of camaraderie, as though we were two old friends about to enjoy a harmless game. But this wasn't a game, not for me. Samuel, he said warmly as he approached. I've been looking forward to this. It's not every day I get to play with someone who has your kind of experience. I'm sure we'll have a great time. I returned his smile, though mine was sharper, more deliberate. I'm sure we will, Leo. It's been a while since I've played with someone as talented as you. He laughed, a sound that grated on my nerves, but I kept my composure. Shall we get started, then? He suggested, gesturing toward the piano that sat in the corner of the room, waiting for us. By all means, I replied, following him to the instrument that had become both my obsession and my weapon. We took our places at the piano, the crowd falling silent in anticipation. The air hummed with quiet excitement, and I could feel Emily's gaze burning into me, filled with an anxiety she couldn't hide. But I didn't look at her. My focus was entirely on Leo, on the man who had unwittingly walked into the trap I had so carefully laid. How about we start with something familiar? I suggested, keeping my tone casual. Something that'll get us both warmed up. Leo nodded, clearly at ease. Sounds good to me. Any suggestions? I pretended to think for a moment, though I already knew exactly what I wanted. How about La Campanella by Liszt? I proposed, knowing full well that it was a challenging piece, one that required precision and dexterity. Leo's eyes gleamed with confidence. Excellent choice, he agreed, not a hint of hesitation in his voice. Let's do it. We began to play, the notes cascading from the piano like a waterfall of sound. The piece was fast and intricate, demanding perfect control from both of us. Leo started strong, his fingers flying over the keys with practiced ease. His face a mask of concentration. But I had prepared for this. I knew the piece inside out and had dissected it down to the smallest detail. As we played, I matched his speed, his precision, note for note, my hands moving with a confidence that startled even me. I could feel the music flowing through me, every ounce of emotion I had buried for so long pouring into the performance. It didn't take long for Leo to realize something was wrong. I saw it in the way his fingers began to falter. Just slightly, as if he were struggling to keep up. His brow furrowed in confusion, the first signs of doubt creeping into his expression. This wasn't the performance he had expected. He had come here to impress, to show off his skills, but instead, he was being met with a challenge he hadn't anticipated. As the piece progressed, I began to subtly shift the tempo, altering the flow just enough to throw him off balance. It was a delicate game, one that required precision on my part, but I had practiced for this moment. The notes that had once been a source of solace for me now became weapons, each one carefully placed to destabilize him. Leo's confidence began to wane. His playing grew more erratic, his fingers slipping on the keys as he struggled to regain control. The crowd, sensing the shift in the performance, grew tense, the air thick with the unspoken realization that something was amiss. Emily's eyes were wide, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched, helpless to intervene. She knew Leo was faltering, knew that I was behind it, but there was nothing she could do to stop the momentum that was building. By the time we reached the final notes, the outcome was clear. Leo, who had begun the piece with such assuredness, was now barely holding it together, his frustration evident in every strained movement. Meanwhile, I finished with a flourish, the final notes ringing out with a precision that left no doubt as to who had dominated the performance. The café fell into an uneasy silence, the crowd unsure of how to react to what they had just witnessed. This wasn't the friendly duet they had expected, it was something far more intense, more personal. Leo sat there, his hands still resting on the keys, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. He had been bested, and he knew it. But more than that, he realized that this hadn't been an accident or a coincidence. This had been deliberate, a calculated move on my part, and the knowledge of it was written all over his face. I stood up slowly, the adrenaline still coursing through me, a sense of victory washing over me. The satisfaction of seeing Leo brought low, of reclaiming my sense of power, was intoxicating. But even as I relished the moment, I could feel Emily's eyes on me, her gaze heavy with a mixture of emotions, shock, fear, and something else I couldn't quite place. The game wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning, the first move in a much larger battle. For now, though, I had won. And as I looked at Leo, still seated at the piano, his confidence shattered. I knew that the balance of power had shifted. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now vulnerable, and I intended to exploit that vulnerability to its fullest. With a final glance at Emily, I turned and walked away, leaving Leo to face the aftermath of the evening alone. The night had ended, but the real duel had only just begun. As the first piece ended and the tension in the cafe thickened, I could see the frustration in Leo's eyes. The confident, self-assured man who had walked in earlier was starting to crack. His smile had faded, replaced by a tight-lipped frown as he tried to regain control of the situation. But it was clear that he was struggling, and I wasn't about to let up. "That was interesting," Leo said, his voice strained as he forced a smile. "How about we try something a bit more challenging?" I nodded, maintaining an air of calm that contrasted sharply with the storm brewing within him. "Of course," I replied, my tone polite but laced with an edge that I knew he could feel. "Why don't we play Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor? It's one of my favorites." I watched as Leo's face briefly betrayed his apprehension. He knew this piece was notoriously difficult, demanding not just technical skill but emotional depth. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down, especially not in front of an audience that included his friends and colleagues. "Sure," he agreed, though the confidence in his voice wavered ever so slightly. "Let's do it." We began to play, and the piece's dark, brooding notes filled the room, enveloping us in its intensity. From the very first chord, I poured everything into the music, every ounce of pain, anger, and betrayal I had felt since discovering Emily's affair. The keys responded to my touch with power and precision that surprised even me, as if they too were instruments of my revenge. Leo, on the other hand, was faltering. His hands, usually so steady, began to slip on the keys, the music losing its coherence as he struggled to keep up. His frustration was palpable, each mistake compounding his growing sense of helplessness. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, allowing a small, smug smile to curl at the edges of my lips. The sight of his unraveling composure was a source of deep satisfaction, and I couldn't resist twisting the knife further. "Having trouble, Leo?" I asked in a low voice, just loud enough for him to hear the music. "You seem a bit off tonight." He didn't respond, his jaw clenched tightly as he tried to focus. But my words had done their damage, planting seeds of doubt that I could see taking root. His playing grew more erratic, the mistakes more frequent, until finally, he hit a wrong note so jarringly off-key that it echoed through the cafe like a scream. There was a pause, a brief moment of stunned silence as everyone processed what had just happened. And then, somewhere in the back of the room, someone snickered. The sound was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to break the dam. Laughter rippled through the crowd, first hesitant, then growing in strength as more people joined in. Leo's face flushed a deep crimson, his hands trembling on the keys as he realized that the room was laughing at him. The man who had prided himself on his musical prowess, who had stolen my wife with his charm and talent, was now the object of ridicule. I didn't waste the opportunity. As the laughter grew, I continued playing, my fingers moving with a fluid grace that only highlighted Leo's failures. Each note I struck was a declaration of superiority, a reminder to everyone present of who the true master was. The shift in the crowd's mood was palpable. What had started as a friendly gathering had turned into a spectacle, with me as the star. The smirks and whispers directed at Leo were undeniable, and the more I played, the more the audience's admiration turned towards me. Emily sat frozen in her seat, her face a mask of horror as she watched the scene unfold. She knew Leo had been humiliated, knew that I was responsible, and yet she couldn't look away. The man she had chosen over me was being torn apart in front of her. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. As the piece drew to a close, I hit the final chord with a flourish, letting the sound hang in the air for a moment before it faded into silence. The cafe erupted into applause, the sound of clapping hands and cheers washing over me like a wave. I stood, bowing slightly to acknowledge the audience's praise, my heart pounding with triumph. Leo, meanwhile, remained seated, his hands still on the piano, his face drained of color. The once proud pianist had been reduced to a figure of pity, and the crowd's applause only served to underline his defeat. I turned to him, my voice dripping with mock concern. "Good effort, Leo," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But it seems you're having an off night. Maybe we should call it quits before things get any worse?" The suggestion hung in the air, a final insult wrapped in the guise of kindness. Leo looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of anger, shame, and something else, something close to fear. He knew he had been bested, that there was no recovering from this. With a stiff nod, he pushed himself away from the piano, not meeting my gaze as he muttered a strained, "Yeah, maybe that's best." As he stood and walked away, the room still buzzing with the aftermath of his public humiliation, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The plan had worked perfectly. Leo had been reduced from a celebrated musician to a laughingstock in the space of a single evening. And everyone had witnessed it. But as I turned to leave, catching a glimpse of Emily's devastated expression, I felt a strange emptiness creeping in. The revenge I had so meticulously planned, the victory I had sought for so long, suddenly felt hollow. The crowd's applause still echoed in my ears, but it no longer brought me any joy. Instead, all I could feel was the cold realization that in destroying Leo, I had also destroyed something within myself. As I stepped out into the night, leaving behind the chaos I had created, I couldn't shake the feeling that the battle I had won had cost me more than I had ever anticipated. The cafe had emptied, leaving behind only the remnants of the evening's spectacle. The clinking of glasses and the hum of conversation had faded, replaced by an almost eerie silence. Leo's departure had been swift and, if I were to be honest, a bit anticlimactic. The crowd's initial enthusiasm had dissipated, and what remained was the quiet aftermath of a public fall from grace. As I gathered my things, preparing to leave, I heard a soft, hesitant voice behind me. I turned to see Leo standing a few feet away, his face pale, his usual composure gone. He looked as though he had been through a storm, his usual charm replaced by a raw, vulnerable desperation. "Samuel," he said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. "Can we talk?" I paused, my hand resting on the door. Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave him with his shame and regret. But another part, the part that had been consumed by this vendetta, felt a strange sense of obligation. After all, this was the moment where everything should come full circle. "What is it, Leo?" I asked coldly, turning to face him fully. I wanted to apologize," he began, his eyes searching mine with a mixture of guilt and remorse. "I know you must have figured out about Emily. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never intended to hurt you." The admission hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken truths. Leo's attempt at an apology felt hollow. A last-ditch effort to salvage something from the wreckage of his reputation. He was no longer the confident, self-assured man I had faced earlier. Now, he was just a man grappling with the consequences of his actions. "Is that supposed to make it better?" I asked, my voice flat. "You think a few words of regret will undo what you've done?" Leo's face fell, the weight of his actions settling in. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice almost pleading. I never meant for any of this to happen. I studied him for a moment, watching the turmoil in his eyes. There was no satisfaction in this encounter, no joy in seeing him so broken. The victory I had sought so fervently had left me feeling more hollow than triumphant. I had hoped that humiliating him would somehow mend the wounds, but all it had done was leave me with a bitter aftertaste. "Save your apologies," I said coldly, turning away. "They don't change anything." With that, I walked out of the cafe, leaving Leo standing alone in the dimly lit room. The night air was cool against my skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the emotions I had been grappling with. As I walked away, I felt a peculiar mix of relief and emptiness, a realization that vengeance, despite its apparent sweetness, had not brought the peace I had hoped for. In the quiet solitude of my apartment, I reflected on the events of the evening. I had achieved my goal, yes, but the victory had come at a cost. The revenge that had consumed me for months had not healed the wounds I had thought it would. Instead, it had only highlighted the emptiness of my pursuit. I knew now that I could no longer continue living in the shadow of this vendetta. Emily and I had reached an impasse, and I couldn't see a way forward with her. The relationship that had once meant everything to me was now a relic of a past I needed to leave behind. As I sat at the piano, the keys cool beneath my fingertips, I made a decision. I would let go of the past, of the anger and the bitterness. I would move forward, not as the man consumed by revenge but as the man I had always wanted to be, a talented pianist, someone who had reclaimed his sense of self through dedication and skill. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it felt right. I would start anew, leave behind the ghosts of my past, and embrace the future I had always dreamed of. The journey would be long and challenging, but it was one I was ready to embark upon. The finality of the decision brought with it a sense of liberation. A release from the shackles of my own making. As the first notes of a new melody filled the room, I realized that while revenge had not brought me solace, it had paved the way for a new beginning. A chance to reclaim my life and become the person I had always aspired to be.